Now, Lincoln could have chose to argue with him, but he didn't. He sat back and he told him a story. He said, you know, this reminds me of an old sea captain who ran his boat on a reef. And of course, Chase's eyes rolled. Here's another Lincoln story. And he said he ran his boat on a reef and he knocked a hole in the bow of the ship and water started pouring in and it's, you know, it looked like the ship was going to sink. And so he sent all of his men, the captain did, to bail the water out. And the captain, went to pray before a statue of the Virgin Mary at the bow of the boat. Well, all of the water kept coming in. It looked like the ship was going to go down. And at last, in a fit of rage, the captain grabbed the statue of the Virgin Mary and threw it overboard. And all of a sudden, the leak stopped. And they bailed the water out and they made it safely to. And when docked for repairs, they found the statue of the Virgin Mary stuck in the hole. And so Lincoln tells Chase this story and then looks at him. And Chase says, you know, I don't understand the point of your story, Mr. President. He said, why? He said, Chase, he said, I don't intend to throw the Virgin Mary overboard, and by that I mean the Constitution. But I'll jam it in the hole if I can. He said, these rebels down south are violating the Constitution to destroy the Union, and I will violate the Constitution if necessary to save the Union. And I suspect that our Constitution is going to be in for a rough go of it before we end this struggle. And Chase thought a minute, and he said, okay, you're right, I get it. And so that's how the first paper money got printed. And I always thought this was interesting that Lincoln didn't argue with him that much. What he did was he told him a story. That's all it did. He just told him a story. He could have ordered him to do it, but he didn't want to order him to do it because he might not never get done. Okay, so the rest of the story. Here's the first paper bill, dollar bill that was printed. And that's not George Washington. That's Solomon Portland Chase. And I always thought that Lincoln put his arm around Chase and as they're walking out the door and said, look, if you do this for me, you can put your own picture on the bill. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's just what occurred to me. The other thing that I found was amazing was that Lincoln really was searching for a general for almost the first 3 years of the war. And this was the last chapter I wrote in the book because I just couldn't figure out. Every time I read a story, there was a new general in charge. And I said, well, what's going on? So I spent quite a bit of time putting this together, and I found out that General Winfield Scott, who was 70-some-odd years old, and talked to Lincoln, and they both agreed that he shouldn't be the guy that leads this. And so Lincoln asked Winfield Scott, well, who would you recommend to take over? And he said, Robert E. Lee. And Robert E. Lee, of course, we all know that he went down to, he said, I can't fight against my home state, Virginia. He became the head of the Confederate Army, and who won most of the battles during the Civil War the first couple of years. It was the Confederacy. Well, so Lincoln is going on this search for a general. Who is it going to be? And I took months off to try to research this. This is before computers and the internet, so I was at the library trying to figure all this stuff out. And I did this chart. And those bars represent the times that these generals were put together. I want to tell you a couple of stories. And one is that he gave George McClellan a chance. And George McClellan was in his early 30s. He was known as the young Napoleon. His position was, I can do it all. Whatever you want me to do, I can do it. And so Lincoln said, okay, we'll give you a chance. So he put him in charge of the military. And McClellan started building up troops. He kept building up troops until he eventually got to 500,000 troops. And that was a good thing. But he wouldn't use those troops. And Lincoln wanted him to use the troops, so he would go over to McClellan and talk to him. And one night on November the 13th, 1861, before that he would go to McClellan a lot to try to encourage McClellan. He went over there to talk to McClellan one evening with Secretary Seward, who was now his friend, and John Hay, his personal assistant. And the story goes that McClellan wasn't there, and the housekeeper said he'll be back in a little while. He went to a wedding. So would you like to wait in the parlor? So the President and Secretary of State and John Hay sit in the parlor, and less than an hour later, McClellan comes back, and the housekeeper says, who's in the living room? And McClellan stomps upstairs and goes to bed. And so Hay and Seward are outraged, and they leave and they walk back to the White House. And Lincoln says, look, it's best at times like this not to be talking about etiquette and personal dignity. He says, let's let it go. Let me worry about it. But after that, it was very rarely that Lincoln ever went to McClellan again. And their relationship started to deteriorate seriously. McClellan called Lincoln a rare bird, and Lincoln would view the Army of the Potomac and said, this isn't the Army of the Potomac, this is McClellan's bodyguard. Another general that he appointed eventually was Joe Hooker. And Joe Hooker was complaining about his boss at the time was Ambrose Burnside. And he actually wrote and said publicly that what the country needed was a dictator, and they should replace Lincoln with a dictator. And so Lincoln heard about this. He said, well, I'm going to give Hooker a chance and see what he does. And so he goes to see Hooker in the field when he appoints him, and he says to him, and this is the famous Hooker letter, and in this letter he says, I've heard that you said this, but it's in spite of this that I'm going to give you this, this position. He says, we're going to support you. Whatever you want, you let us know, but you must act. And it was a very nice, long letter. And when he went out to see him, he basically talked to him about the substance of this letter. And then he reached in his hat, and he pulled this letter out, and he handed it to him. And he said, here is the substance of what we've just discussed. Now, isn't that interesting? Have you ever been in corporate America where you had somebody that said they were going to do something, and then 6 months later they say, well, I don't remember that. Well, Lincoln anticipated that, and he had it in writing, which I found amazing. Well, eventually Hooker decides, and Lincoln both decide that Hooker's not the guy for the job. Hooker agreed to it, and just before Gettysburg, General Henry Halleck recommends Lincoln that they appoint George Gordon Meade. And Halleck says to Lincoln, he's from Pennsylvania, which is where this battle is going to be fought. And Lincoln says, well, Meade will fight well on his own dunghill. And so they appointed Meade, and he did perform well, you know. But after the battle was over, though, when Lee was trying to retreat back across the Rappahannock, he would go for a day, and Meade would chase him and stop. When Lee would camp, Meade would camp. And they did this for a couple of days, and when Lee finally reached the river, it was swollen, and they couldn't get across. And so Lincoln was sending telegrams. Attack! You can end the war right now. You take attack, attack. And he wouldn't attack, even though some of his generals wanted him to. And basically, the waters receded and Lee made it to safety. Lincoln summoned Meade a couple of weeks later, and he said, you know, the only thing I think of, well, your behavior was an old woman trying to shoo her geese across a creek. Well, he finally found a general that he appointed was Sam Grant, and he had heard, you know, Grant was winning battles out on the Western Theater, and there was a kind of a smear campaign mounted against him, and a group of temperance workers came into Lincoln and said, you know, we think you should fire Grant because he was drunk on whiskey at Shiloh. And Lincoln was reported to have said, well, maybe we should send a bottle of that whiskey to all of our generals. And then they asked him why did he appoint Grant, and Lincoln wrote in this letter, he said, Grant habitually wears an expression as if he had determined to drive his head through a brick wall and was about to do it. And here's Grant at Cold Harbor, and most of the pictures you see of Grant during the Civil War are in the field, not in a studio. And Grant actually told Lincoln, I don't want an office in Washington, I want to ride with the Army of the Potomac. Now that was music to his ears. Okay, so what Lincoln was doing on this 3-year quest was he was giving all of these generals, you see those black bars there, he was giving them all 3 to 6 months to perform. And when they didn't perform, he would either slide them aside, or he would split their command, or he'd outright fire them. Until he finally found Grant. And if you look on March the 10th, 1864, everything stays the same. You go back to that chart. Halleck was made the chief of staff. Grant was put in charge of all the military. And that's a system that loosely still holds today for the American military. Lincoln created that system by himself, basically. And he just basically said, I can't spare this man. He's good. We're going to keep him. And Grant immediately picks generals in his own image. And he takes Phil Sheridan and William Tecumseh Sherman. And in the campaigns of 1864, Sheridan goes into the Shenandoah Valley. We all know where Sherman went. And Grant himself went into the Wilderness Campaign. And remember, this was also 1864. That's an election year.